Hi everyone. So I'm here to talk about this novel, Nigger Heaven by Carl Van Vechten. Now, just to give you a little context before we start, it was published in 1926, which was just a year after The Great Gatsby was published, and the same year as Alain Locke's The New Negro Anthology, which was a landmark in Harlem Renaissance letters. It really gave a lot of visibility to African American poets. Now, Nigger Heaven was written by Carl Van Vechten. It wasn't his first novel. He'd been publishing novels with Alfred Knopf, who promoted a lot of African American writers. Van Vechten was white, but he sympathized with a lot of Harlemites and was very close to many of them, most notably Langston Hughes, who was one of his best friends. So 1926, also around the time of Lady Chatterley's Lover, which was published in 1928. So, you know, as you can see, it was a novel that was published at a time when modernism was in full swing and modernist topics were being widely discussed by artists and writers alike. Now, just to give you a bit of historical context, as I said before, the Harlem Renaissance was a kind of cultural festival that lasted for 2 decades, but this was largely because it was right in the middle of the Roaring Twenties, also known as the Gay Twenties, a period of great festivity after the First World War. Nobody wanted to go through the punishing rigmarole of war anymore, and so they wanted to party a lot. You know, this festive mood was prevalent throughout the world and throughout America, but let's say that it came to a kind of climax in Harlem. Okay, so that's just to give you a little context. Now, the reception the book received was rather mixed. It met with very mixed reviews. White audiences or white readers tended to see it as a progressive novel, rather unproblematically, and whereas in Harlem itself, the African American intelligentsia tended to see it as a bit of a commercial venture. Others praised it to the skies. Most, if not all, of Carl Van Vechten's friends found that the title was a bit problematic, if not very problematic. County Cullen didn't speak to Van Vechten for 14 years after the novel was published, and there were a few writers. Ralph Ellison, who wrote later in the 50s, also saw it as a novel that was rather debauched and that wasn't really what was needed at the time. He also had a distaste for Van Vechten himself, who he found unpleasant. So now, for those who found it an interesting and positive novel, you had Langston Hughes, who was Van Vechten's friend. They disagreed on many topics. Van Vechten didn't like politics and art to mix at all. Langston Hughes was, you know, had communist sympathies. Van Vechten didn't at all. So, you know, they disagreed. They didn't see eye to eye on a number of issues. And Langston Hughes came back in his autobiography to the topic of the novel's title, particularly, which he found particularly distasteful. Now, this being said, even though Carl Van Vechten's father, told him not to use the title on his deathbed, Van Vechten went ahead and used the title. He particularly liked the title for several reasons. Now, some historians have argued that it was just a kind of crass commercial venture, but that was part of it, certainly. He did see it as a catchy title, and it is, and partly the novel is still read today because of its title. It went down in literary history because so many people bought it, because they were drawn to the sort of forbidden allure of that the title promised. Even in those days, it was politically incorrect to refer to it, even though the expression itself was used in the African American community, as I'll show in a moment. Despite all his friends' misgivings, his father's misgivings, Van Vechten went ahead and used it. Now, he argued until the end of his life that the title was ironic, it was intended ironically, and defended it as such. And he couldn't understand that people weren't sophisticated enough to understand the different layers, the layering of the title, and that it wasn't to be understood unironically, and that in the novel itself it comes to acquire different meaning. So, to explain what Nigger Heaven is, the expression itself, I'll give you. I have an illustration here that was used to advertise the novel. I'll just show you that. So, as you can see, you have this balcony, and that's where African Americans were put in theaters, right? So theaters at the time were segregated. So you can say that's a kind of Jim Crow policy within culture, operating within culture, and the white audiences were placed below. We can't see them there in the picture, but they had a better view, and the tickets at the top were much cheaper, which was a way of demeaning the African American audience. So it was called Nigger Heaven because it was placed above the others, and at the same time, the expression was used by African Americans, as I say, white Americans too, but let's say that it became just an expression for the place they were allotted in theaters. So it's kind of paradoxical in that even though it's that position in the theater was meant as something negative, something demeaning, at the same time they were above the white audiences, and in a sense were looking down on them. So there is that kind of ambiguity to that expression, that in a sense there was some visual power in being placed above, and Van Vechten points that out in the novel as well. Okay. So now I'll show you the passage where he discusses the expression in the novel itself. So now, if I can see it here. Okay, well, maybe we'll get to it because I'm a bit lost here in my notes. Okay, so now the expression is ironic because at some point in the novel, the main character, the main male character, who's called Byron, he ends up finding Harlem a bit of a hell. So it's ironic in that Harlem, known as the Celestial City, to some Harlemites, Arna Bontemps said that it was a foretaste of heaven, as I pointed out in my last video. So this is a kind of damning of that simplified, reductive view of Harlem. That it was much more complex than just a paradise for African Americans, where they were free to do whatever they liked and enjoyed amazing status. As Langston Hughes pointed out in his autobiography, places like the Cotton Club operated on Jim Crow laws, right? Laws that segregated people. So, very few African Americans were let in there unless they were famous. So, as he points out in the autobiography, most African Americans didn't like the Cotton Club at all, right? Even though it gave them a showcase and allowed their music to be known to audiences nationwide. Right, so just to finish up on reception, now James Weldon Johnson argued that the novel paid colored people the rare tribute of writing about them as people rather than as puppets. Right, so James Weldon Johnson was one of the gatekeepers of the Harlem Renaissance. So he had some authority. Now the other major gatekeeper, along with Alain Locke, was W.E.B. Du Bois. Now he panned the novel and was very unfavorable about it in his review. A review he published in The Crisis, which was the NAACP's official literary organ. And so he argued that it did violence to black folk, is the quote. He even called it cheap melodrama. Right? So it's hard to be tougher on the novel than that. Now, part of the reason Du Bois disliked the novel was that he had a tendency to view art as propaganda. He even felt it was the duty of African American artists to offer propaganda, to promote the Negro cause, and so art that didn't live up to that expectation was bad art or useless art. Now, it wasn't that he wanted to idealize African American culture in every way, but not far from it. He did want to promote a view of art as something beautiful and therefore close to idealism. So the novel received inflammatory reviews because it was partially inflammatory itself. Now, I think it's been overstated, or at least in retrospect, it seems that this inflammatory view of the novel, as slightly raunchy, it goes too far. It's overstated from our perspective, at least, in that not much very shocking, if at all, happens. I mean, a lot of the goings on are suggested, And so that, you know, there is very little that if you compare it, say, to D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, there's nothing very shocking at all. I'll just read you a little passage here. So page 126. Right. So this is when the lovers, Byron and Mary. She's called Mary Love. Her surname is Love. Pretty allegorical. Right. So this is the end of a chapter. She says, "You do love me, Byron. You do love me?" She wanted to hear him say it again and again. He stopped her mouth with kisses, and these two were the whole of his reply. Right, so, you know, there isn't much there. It's pretty elliptical. Even Stendhal gave us more quite a few decades earlier. So, you know, later on there are a few more explicit references here. So there's a performer and that they're watching, and Mary is, it says that her dress was cut so low in front that the little depression between her firm round breasts was plainly visible. Her golden brown back was clearly entirely nude to the waist. The dress was circled with wide bands of green and black sequins designed to resemble the fur of the leopard. A tiara of sapphires sparkled in her hair, and a choker of these stones around her throat. Right, so there is some attention drawn to body parts, but nothing very shocking by our standards, certainly. Just one last passage, so that you get a flavor of the novel. Right, so this is at the very end, and they're in this nightclub called the Black Venus. They're watching, at least Byron is alone watching a performer. Well, he's with another woman this time, but the performer is described in this way. The girl, she could have been no more than 16, stood entirely nude. She was pure black, with savage African features, thick nose, thick lips, bushy hair, which hovered about her face like a lanate halo, while her eyes rolled back so far that only the whites were visible. Right, so I'll go back to that passage later for other reasons. Right, so the novel was considered to offer a debauched view of Harlem, and certain elite Harlemites didn't want that view aired because they were slightly Victorian and puritanical, but also because that's the view that white America had already. So they felt there was no need to pander to white American cliches, stereotypes of what went on in Harlem. So, you know, that they felt that that there was no need for it, that it was just pure sensationalism, and didn't promote the Negro cause. Right, so the last reaction I'd like to turn to is the contemporary response. Now, David Levering-Lewes has actually called the novel a colossal fraud. He's a contemporary historian in his 80s now. Now, he said that the novel was peddled to us as an uplifting novel, and he feels that the uplifting message, was overshadowed by what he calls the throb of the tom-tom. Right, so I'll go back to what I think about that. It's a very damning condemnation of the novel. Other contemporary views of the novel are more positive. Emily Bernard, who's Van Vechten's biographer, said that the title is an open wound, but that she was full of admiration for Van Vechten's ability to cross boundaries. So I'll be examining that notion of crossing boundaries. And Kathleen Pfeiffer, who wrote the introduction to this book, she said that it was a sincere and earnest appeal that really wanted to promote and foster the tremendous talent that was present in Harlem, and also the frustration. It really foregrounds the frustration of African American writers who had difficulty, getting their work published at the time. Even though there was a great amount of opportunity, it was still hard to publish, even in those days. She goes on to say that the novel is craftily packaged as, and that it is actually progressive discourse, right? That's craftily packaged. So she points out that the novel's title is a good example of the fact that you should never judge a book by its title. Right. So. Enough on that. I'll give you a summary now of the structure of the book. So it's structured in 3 parts. The first part is a short prologue where we follow a pimp on his walk around town. It only lasts about a few dozen pages. And then we have half the book which is devoted to the perceptions of Mary Love, the female protagonist, and the second half of the book is devoted to the perceptions of Byron, her lover. The very last part, well, it's not really a part, but it's added at the end, is a glossary where you get terms explained, right? So it's called the Glossary of Negro Words and Phrases, and so it's partially a serious glossary and partially what you could say in the trickster tradition of African American letters, in that some of the words pretend to be defined. So you get words like hoochie pap, and you're under the entry to hoochie pap, you're told to see booty, and when you go and see booty, you're told to see hoochie pap, right? So they both mean, hoochie pap and booty both mean sex. So I think maybe he's playing with puritanical reactions, but I think just being playful, really, mostly. So this kind of glossary was something that ethnic communities around the world were doing at that period. In Ireland, for example, you had Lady Morgan's The Wild Irish Girl, which also included footnotes explaining certain aspects of Ireland to the British. So this is very similar here in this novel. And the Harlem Renaissance, the term, it was actually based on the Celtic revival in Ireland, right? So it wasn't imitative, but it wanted to suggest the same kind of literary flowering. It wanted to mirror the Irish Renaissance in letters. Right, so that's the structure of the novel. Now, the story is quite simple. It's about well, first as I said, we have this pimp who's called the Scarlet Creeper, and we're not sure why he's there at the start. He just appears. We follow him around. He's pretty violent. He's pretty sleazy, and you could say that he's included at the start as a kind of confirmation of what white America thought that Harlem was all about, which it was partly, of course, but not at all entirely by any means. And so just like the title itself, you could say that the prologue is a way of confirming white stereotypes of African Americans, and therefore a way of drawing in people who have these slightly cliched views, these essentialist views, drawing them in, giving them a bit of sensation. All right, so it's a kind of sensationalist tactic, and then when we get to the part on Mary Love, drawing the reader into a totally different world, a totally different mindset. So it's hard to imagine a greater contrast between the two first characters, the Scarlet Creeper, who really is a creep. The word creeper itself actually means somebody who intercedes between a husband and his wife, as we're told in the glossary. And Mary herself is very reserved, on the contrary. So she can't stand being touched by anyone. So they're absolute foils, Mary Love and the Scarlet Creeper, both in their names and in their characters. So then you have we enter this world with Mary Love of middle class respectability, but also a great refinement of sentiment. Mary Love is, as her name indicates, someone who knows how to truly love. She loves the hero as he should like to be loved. He unfortunately doesn't experience her love the way he should, because of his pride, and because of the racial situation, even in Harlem, which defeats him ultimately. So the novel really gives us this feeling of entering a very subtle mind, which I'd like to compare to contemporary video games. There was one recently that's been invented where you see yourself, you see your own features on the screen with dark coloring, and apparently it makes you identify more with African Americans or colored people in general. So it's actually a video game that makes you lose any racist conceptions, right? So I think the novel, 100 years before the invention of this video game, does exactly that. It makes you identify with this young woman, because she's so refined, because she struggles, because she's in love, and so potentially it has the capacity to transform someone who would have a stereotypical understanding of what it is to be an African American. So this young woman, Mary Love, is very well. She's quite withdrawn. All her friends are easygoing, outgoing. They like to dance. They like to be kissed, in speakeasies and places like that. It's the time of the prohibition, so alcohol is prohibited. So there was quite a lot of a desire to escape restrictions, especially after the First World War, as I said. So she's very reserved, and until she meets Byron, and then she falls headfirst into love and experiences all the the passion she's been restraining, and also its downsides, the suffering involved in passion. So Byron, as his name indicates, is a more conflicted character. He is drawn to Mary. I don't know if he's actually capable of love. You get the feeling in the novel that, although it's not actually said in so many words, that his back is broken, that his spirit is broken, and that his desire to prove himself worthy in the socio-political context makes him unprepared for love. He's just obsessed by making it as a writer, and therefore doesn't really see Mary for what she is. She tries to give him ideas. She gives him an idea for a novel to write about Christophe, the Black Napoleon, which is a great idea. And she outlines that idea to him. She hands it to him on a plate, as it were, and but he refuses to take her suggestion, and later goes off and writes this rather spineless, lame short story. Even though he's got literary talent, it's a very spineless story. And so when she reads it, and when he gets the short story rejected by editors, she tries to offer valuable advice on how to improve it, or how to scrap it and write a more interesting story about what he knows, right? His own story in Harlem. But he refuses to take it. He's too proud. His father has just taken away this amount of money that he gave him on a monthly basis, and because his father feels that he's lazy and that he should go out and do some proper work. He doesn't view Byron's literary aspirations as something that his son should be engaged in. So he ends up having to look for demeaning work, like operating an elevator, even though he has himself had a college education. Right? He makes fun of himself at one point, saying that, well, since he can't get a lift up the ladder, he's going to be operating the lift. And in the Harlem Renaissance, you have many writers who use the lift as a symbol, sometimes an ironic symbol of ascending the social ladder. So in the end, he doesn't make it as a writer. He doesn't. He isn't able to value Mary's love, and so he falls into the arms of a woman who is, well, not only debauched, in inverted commas, but she's also a bit of a man-hater. She seems both sadistic and masochistic at the same time. She is what you could call a Black Venus, in the sense that Black Venus is used in a double sense in the novel, both as a place that celebrates African American experience, but it's also used as a kind of dark love, in that it's kind of negative love, self-destructive love, which is what he experiences with this character called Lasca, who's actually based on a real person in Harlem. The novel was something of a roman à clef, which angered some as well. Now the novel ends rather negatively, which makes it a something of a tragedy. Usually the ending of a work of art, a work of literature, determines its generic belonging. So even though the rest of the novel is not a comedy, but it doesn't seem to be leading to tragedy until the end, it does end rather depressingly. I won't spoil the ending. And everything I've said about the summary shouldn't spoil your own experience of the novel, because it's so rich, just the style, but everything that goes on. I've left out all the details, so it's full of sap. It's full of sap and juice. I haven't reamed it or anything for you. So that's the story, the outline, the plot arch, or sorry, the plot arc. Now, I'm going to argue that the novel is a novel that is colorblind to a certain extent, but not entirely. Right? So if you compare it, for example, to Toni Morrison's novels, some of them, especially the latest ones, you often don't know which of the characters are black, which of the characters are white. She does this on purpose, so that you engage with what the writer or what the character is going through, regardless of his color. So you could say that really is an example of colorblind literature, where it doesn't matter whether the character is black or white or any other color. So there is absolutely no attempt, as we'll see, to attain that kind of color blindness. Now I'll also think about whether or not the novel is essentialist. Is it a racist novel? And to what extent it tends to engage in stereotypes and subvert them. Right, so see you in the next video about that.